Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our conversation, The Business of Race. My name is ReGina Newkirk Rucci. I'm the Director of Equity for 90 Forward. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Kimberly Allen, who is the CEO of 90 Forward, as well as Deirdre Conner, who is a board member for 90 Forward and a communications expert. So thank you, ladies, for joining me today. Wow, we've got a lot of various issues that have come up lately. So let's just get right into it. So I think the first issue that is sort of top of the social media conversation is the incident that happened at Brigham Young University with the Duke volleyball player being called racial slurs in the middle of a game. Now, several things have happened since then. There really wasn't any response to it. That was allowed to continue throughout the game. Her parents were to meet with some of the staff members from Brigham Young. One of those staff members didn't show up for that meeting. I believe it was the assistant director. Then they have banned a person from being able to attend the games because they said that was the person who was making the slurs. It has now come to light that perhaps that was not the right person. There's a lot of stuff going on here. And so while we all know this is an atrocious situation, and we feel so sorry for Rachel, who was the Duke volleyball player in this involved in this event, I really want to get into how should Brigham Young have handled this situation? Sort of what kinds of things should they be looking at to make sure that they don't have another situation where they're all plastered over the news because of racial slurs and issues coming from people in attendance at their events?
Well, I think, ReGina, we started this conversation very just pointed in that it's a culture issue. It is indicative of the environment in which people are allowed to act in certain ways that are tolerated. Because regardless of whether or not the person who ended up being banned was the correct person or not, no one jumped in immediately to stop whoever it was from saying the things, from pointing out, hey, we don't do that here. That is not what that's not what's tolerated at BYU. These are guests in our house, and we want to make sure that they feel a welcome part of this community, even in a competitive environment. And the fact that that didn't happen, even if it being the wrong person, which was also after the fact, it was not an immediate action that happened, says that there is some cultural issues. And I don't mean culture in terms of people's background. I mean culture in terms of the air that the BYU institution breathes, that there is some issues there that race is not tolerated, celebrated, enjoyed, and respected in this space. Different races, different cultures, different backgrounds. And it was just unfortunate that Rachel was subjected to that, not only from the perspective of being an athlete who is already the only Black person on her team, but also being in this in a place unfamiliar, a visiting arena, if you will, with people she doesn't know, and just not feeling very isolated and called out, and that is very traumatic.
Yeah, I think anyone who ever participated in college or high school athletics, like immediately in reading that story, just connected to what that environment must have been like for her. And and I think also it's important to kind of set this against the backdrop of some of the history underpinning the university and the faith that it's associated with, and just understanding that there have been many, many decades of challenges around racism. So, I would imagine that knowing that kind of adds an additional layer. But when you read the interview with the athlete herself, who shared a lot about the experience and what happened after, she kind of pointed to it right there and saying, hey, I feel like if this had been happening at my home university, the game would have been stopped immediately. And without saying, hey, this is what they should have done. Like, I kind of read that and I was like, oh yeah, yes, that's what should have happened.
And I think that is indicative of the culture, because somebody felt comfortable shouting that out in that environment. B, nobody said anything. She said something to the coaching staff. The coaching staff said something to the BYU officials. They moved them to a different part of the court, and then it got more intense. So when you start talking about those cultural indicators, this means that you're in an environment where that type of racism is celebrated. And so if BU really wants to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone is treated fairly, as they've stated after the fact in many statements that they've made, you have to address the culture that you're creating. This is a school that has 24,000 white students, and I believe it's 117 Black students. This is you're asking Black students to come into an extremely white environment, and you are going to have to address some of those historical aspects that you spoke of that feed into those beliefs. And you're going to have to do that proactively. This is not a situation where you can just pretend it away and everything's going to be better. These kinds of things let you know that you really do have a cultural issue that you have to address. And I think you have to address it directly. All right, so that's Brigham Young. And I also do want to mention too, that I think Duke, while I appreciate the fact that they responded in talking to somebody at Brigham Young University, do you think their response should have been a little bit stronger as well in demanding that stop immediately before they continue play? So some of those times we also have to be stronger advocates for people of color when we are in positions of power to do so.
I think that's a great point, because sometimes when stories like this come out, the attention kind of gets all placed on the individual who was the victim of the circumstances. And then people start to litigate, what should she have done or not done? And, all of this, when really the attention needs to be on the folks who were in positions of authority around her, whether they be from the other team and their home court, or whether they be from her own team, is like thinking about, she said in the article, she's like, I'm glad they didn't stop the game because I wanted to keep playing. And it's like, well, she shouldn't really have been responsible for even saying whether she thought that should have happened or not. When you're a student athlete, you're playing in the game, and you should be really only responsible for the way that you act and you interact with your teammates and the other team. The responsibility for deciding whether the game should be stopped or not stopped really shouldn't rest with the student athlete. It really should be resting with the coaches and the facility and so on and so forth. So I think it's just kind of an example of, sometimes our focus lands on the wrong person and the wrong actors in situations like these.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to look at everybody and the responses everyone could have, should have made in that situation.
Yeah, there's work being done around like the bystander effect that happens when people of color are being in some way traumatized. And what does it mean to, sort of stand by and observe? Is it, paralysis that you just don't know what to do versus walking away and, ignoring the situation versus sort of jumping in immediately and, coming to someone's aid. And not that Rachel is this fragile person, right, who just needs all of this protecting, right, and not, to suggest that she is fragile in that way. But I wholeheartedly agree with you in that it should not have, she shouldn't have to say, I'm happy that they did it. Because even if in that moment she feels like they didn't, I'm willing to hang my hat on the fact that had they done it, that she probably would have been that much more affirmed in her team's culture, and the fact that they would protect her, and that this team really is about everyone on the team and not some of the people on the team. And again, not saying that they don't care about her and that they for some reason were willing to let her, sort of hang out alone. But it says a lot when you go the extra mile to make sure that everybody on your team truly feels protected and accepted and like they belong. I think it would have gone a long way for building that sort of team environment that I'm sure they build in other ways. But this was just a real missed opportunity to step up and demonstrate what it looks like to be an ally. And perhaps they haven't had to have a lot of practice, which I would also say, if you haven't had a lot of practice, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. It just probably means either you missed it or you've been ignoring it. But there needs to be space for people to be able to understand, be able to recognize the warning signs of racial transgressions, microaggressions, macroaggressions. This happens to be really grotesque. But what are the other subtle ways that racism is allowed to exist in places of employment or institutions of learning that people, because you're not a person of color, you don't even recognize it as such? And so how do we train people to be allies, to recognize those things so that they can speak up in a timely fashion and defend what can be, it's a small gesture, but a grand gesture that I don't have to always be the one to step up and say something.
And that's an excellent point. I think these are the kinds of things that we really want organizations and institutions to be looking at. So now we're going to move on to the Food Network, where the Food Network awarded a show to Tabitha Brown, who is a YouTube influencer, a Black woman who is a vegan enthusiast and really talks about how becoming a vegan really changed her life. She's been in Goalie commercials. She's got a new line at Target. She's sort of been what I would consider to be blowing up as far as popularity. And so she had been given a prime slot in the evening, a primetime slot. There seemed to be some dispute with the Food Network, as her social media said that she really wasn't going to change who she was. And then she got relegated to a midday show, a midday slot where it's all reruns and brand new shows go to die. So really want to talk about, because the public perception has been Food Network, which is by and large a very white network. There are a few shows that feature chefs of color, but it is few and far between. You've got a new show featuring a chef of color, and now she's been moved, and she's saying that she's not going to change who she is. So how should Food Network have handled this issue? We don't really 100% know what the issue is, but we certainly know that the perception is that this is being handled this way because of race. So what should the Food Network be doing to address this?
So ReGina, I think there's actually a common thread between the BYU incident that we just talked about and this, which is, from what I understand, there were even some questions about how the show was being promoted in the first place, whether it was getting the same amount of promotion. And I keep thinking back to readiness, and sort of when we talk about culture, it's not like, are you a good person or a bad person? It's really like knowing what we know about the history and context of the situation. What can we do to sort of pre-prepare? Like with the BYU situation, hey, knowing what we know about the struggles that the organization has had in the past, knowing that this person was coming into an environment where she perhaps was the only Black person on the team, or maybe even in the stands, that calls for some, where you have a culture of kind of being committed to these things, that calls for some like preparation on what are we going to do to ensure that this is a welcoming environment and a supportive and safe environment. Same here. It's like, hey, this may be a new and important choice for the Food Network. What are we going to do to set this up for success? And so to me, that's sort of like the interesting common thread of, hey, how was this sort of thought about ahead of time and prepared with all of those ingredients to make it successful? And it doesn't seem like that was there from what I understand.
And I think it's very difficult to be in a state of being pre-prepared if you don't have all the voices at the table, because you're going to miss those viewpoints, those things that people of color would see and expect from experience. And it is crucial to have people of color have those voices represented at all levels of decision making, because my bet would be that when the Food Network decided to make this move, they never even saw the potential racial implications. And that is a big problem in being prepared, when anyone of color could have told them that if there was somebody in that decision-making process.
Absolutely.
And in addition to that, the demographic that they could have introduced to Food Network, who, folks who might watch Cartier Brown, Miss Brown, who has her show on there from Low Country, South Carolina, right? To feature a different type of Black woman who is vegan and really about, how food has been used as medicine to heal, and really show the complexities of the Black culinary experience. I think they really missed an opportunity to watch that grow and to blossom. But it's also sort of this idea: if you're not intentional with, I'm gonna call it, you're not intentional with the blessing, you're gonna fumble it, right? And so they were not necessarily, it doesn't seem, right, from what we know so far, that they were intentional in why they were bringing her on. They had what was in their mind the goal of bringing her on, but they missed all of the byproducts of bringing her on in a high traffic time slot on their network. And one of the things I think businesses and corporations have to think about in this movement right now, where people have the choice, people have had a taste of freedom and what it means to be free of traditional, antiquated corporate culture, and to show up and be authentically exactly who we are in any space, that those same rules are not going to apply anymore. And people have the option to, start their own network and, show up on their own YouTube channels and create their own followings, as Tabitha has done through Target with her clothing line, right? To align themselves with brands that are willing and truly embracing what it means to be an individual in this world. In larger organizations who refuse to adapt are going to miss out on that talent, and I think ultimately become extinct, because they are catering to an audience who has fully embraced freedom and tasted it, and are not willing to go back and not willing to associate themselves with brands who are not stepping into the 21st century.
I also think that we've missed some crucial lessons as we talk about corporations being antiquated, and I call them the Black Panther Get Out lessons, right? Black Panther is the, I believe, third, maybe even second largest grossing MCU movie, right? $1 billion movie. It is a Black cast. It is well done. And you can feature people of color. If you do it in quality, everyone will come, right? Same thing with Get Out, which not only is this very racially based storyline, but what I would consider not the most positively racially based storyline, but it's a well-told story that makes sense people went to see it. So one of the things that I'm concerned about with Tabitha's comment is that there's also this stereotype that we want to push people of color into. So if you are an Asian chef, then you're going to have to do your show this way to market to the Asian market. If you are a Indian American chef, then you're going to have to wear a sari and dress this way and do this type of food to appeal to the Indian market, as opposed to recognizing that people have a propensity for a variety of types of foods in this situation, and want to see people of great personality, who have interest, who know how to cook. And it doesn't matter if their skin tone is like mine or not. And I think that is the bigger issue that often gets missed with corporations in this diversity marketing. I've got to have a Black person to market to a Black audience. And my idea of what a Black audience is extremely stereotypical, as opposed to saying I want to get a variety of people to market to everyone and market to the different niche markets that I want to pursue. All right, so last but not least, because we said we've got quite a few. I remember we were only going to hit 3 when there's many, many more to talk about. But last but not least is the situation with Whole Foods. So Whole Foods, after George Floyd's murder, Jeff Bezos, so Amazon acquired Whole Foods. So Jeff Bezos is the CEO of Whole Foods. Right after George Floyd's murder, he made a very public statement about the fact that he supports Black Lives Matter. He had someone on his, I think it was one of his social media feeds, make a racial slur, and he said, "You are the kind of customer that we're happy to lose," very publicly stating that he was behind this movement. At the same time, he had managers sending employees home, suspending them for wearing Black Lives Matter face masks at work, when there was a rule about face masks, but that wasn't being enforced. People were wearing all kinds of messaging to support various groups and causes at the stores. And so the employees wanted to sue. So there was a statement that the US Circuit Court found that they really didn't have the right to sue, but now the National Labor Board is taking on the case. There's so much behind this, and I think it has put Whole Foods in a spot that they really didn't want to be in, from the media attention, as well as what I would consider to be strained relationships with employees. But I want to talk about how they wound up in this situation in the first place. So what do you think about all of this, with employees being able to, not being able to, kind of sort of being able to, depending at what store you're at, and this happening? You can't wear a Black Lives Matter mask when our CEO is on on TV saying that Black Lives Matter.
I think this is very similar to the Sesame Place messaging from before, where we see a very clear disconnect in between what the leadership is saying is the climate and culture, and what folks on the ground are actually doing and reinforcing as part of the climate and culture. And I think this happens in a lot of corporations where leadership wholeheartedly believes that this is what the culture that their organization is embracing. And they are in fact encouraging people to, make sure that your employees feel supported and heard and all of these things, and making sure that we're enforcing this, reinforcing a strong DEIB culture. However, what happens with size and popularity and franchise, ownership and things, and general managers and everybody else, when you get too big, it's very challenging to ensure that these cultural things are enforced on the ground level. And so you end up with people, there are varying degrees of compliance or embracing of this culture. And so it's very similar to what I think I said when we talked about Sesame Place. And even thinking back to the conversation we just had about Tabitha Brown, you have to find ways to, one, screen how people really do identify with the culture of the organization that you're hiring to be leaders, because they are many yous. They are representing you out in the face in the community when when you're not there. So how are you really transferring that culture? How are you ensuring that folks are receiving, believing, adopting, and enforcing that culture? And then I think you also just have to be ready for people to really call you on these values. Because as an employee, if my CEO is telling me that this is who we are, I believe that. And so I'm going to wear this mask in solidarity with the movement that I personally identify with. And I'm going to test this culture. People are going to test the culture to see if it's really there. And if you're not fully ready to embrace that, the fallout can be this. And so I think as corporations, you have to figure out ways to screen people as they come in, because they're going to be representatives of your culture, the face of your culture. And if they're not on board with what you're espousing as a leader, there's going to be some friction, because people are going to test if that's truly the basis for the organization.
I think it could be really tempting to look at the Whole Foods case and say, oh, this is not relevant to me because this is a major multinational corporation with, a gazillion employees and so on. But this is actually a situation that could happen really at any size business or organization. And so I think the lessons from it are a lot more applicable than it might seem on the face of it. And it does go back to what Kim was saying about creating a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and being consistent about that messaging, looking at how it's manifesting throughout the organization, as opposed to sort of like, oh, this is our DEI statement, we're just gonna throw it up there and hope for the best. So I think I would, if anyone's kind of looking at it being like, well, this is clearly an issue of just a company that's big and not everybody got the message, that's something that could happen at a company that's really, really big or really, really small.
And I would say that for me, there are two distinct issues here. One is culture. And I think that people think a statement is culture, and it's not. So for instance, I make the statement often that I really want to lose weight. However, there's not a single piece of exercise equipment in my house. My freezer is full of ice cream. And, I make cream-based sauces, and I buy, matter of fact, my freezer has, I think, probably about 10 boxes of butter, right? If we're looking at the culture in my house, I don't want to lose weight. I want to eat food that tastes good. Even though that's in direct disagreement with the statement. But culture is ongoing, what's happening every day. And so I think one of the things that often happens as it relates to DEIB culture is that people think that they can make a statement, they can have a set of values, they can make a proclamation, they can put a message on a website, whereas culture is really lived out every day. If you are not building a culture, cultures do not just happen, you build them. And so you may be accidentally building one that you don't want to build, but they are still built. And so you have to feed into that daily. And as you said, the consistency is what does that. So how do you start your meetings? What does your mission statement say? What issues in the community are you supporting? What is your messaging when you're going out into the community? How do you handle conflicts? What is tolerated and is not tolerated in your organization? All of those things feed into culture and give employees an indication of what it is. And that leads to the second piece that for me is challenging, is consistency. So I had an HR professional tell me, it's actually more important to be consistent than it is to be right. If you were consistently wrong, you were in better legal standing than if you chose this moment to be legally right, but that's not what you've been doing previously. The fact why this became such an issue was you have a face mask policy that you're not enforcing. So you're allowing people to wear pride masks. You're allowing people to wear masks that support a city or a community. You are allowing people to make a variety of statements in a mask, but then this one, no. And that's confusing for employees. Now I don't know, because now I'm with the employees. It seems like it's a Black Lives Matter issue, which didn't our CEO just say that? Even though the managers are saying, no, it's a face mask policy issue, but you didn't do that before. So you're going to have to be consistent in how you execute policies. And that's for everything, because you don't want your employees to be confused. That's unfair to them. I don't know what's right or not if this thing you do go after, but this one you don't. Where am I going to land? So consistency is something that I think a lot of corporations also overlook, but is extraordinarily important to building culture, really building trust within employees, and being clear about who you are and what you stand for.
And I think what's interesting, ReGina, is that the things that you're talking about, building culture, building trust, like, yes, these are really hard things to do, but these aren't like some mysterious kind of squishy thing. Like, there's a lot of really great evidence and research on what that looks like within organizations. And yeah, I mean, there's not like a perfect recipe, but these aren't like hard, nebulous things that nobody really knows how to do them. Like, there's a pretty good basis of evidence on what it looks like to be consistent to stated values and build trust in organizations. You know, now it's not always the most easy thing to do. Sometimes it may not initially feel like a profitable thing to do for a company, but the research really points to that it is long-term more profitable for organizations, as Kim was kind of talking about before, and there's good research around that. And it also points to, you know, better decision making. And so if anybody's like, oh, how do we do that? Like, just know that there are folks who do a lot of thinking and writing about that, and that there are pathways to solutions to some of those problems.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times business really wants it to be dollars and cents, and this feels squishy. Right? It feels like, oh, that's a nice thing to do. And that's why people aren't putting more time into it. But it does translate into dollars and cents. If you are getting employees who are more aligned with what your organization stands for, then you're going to have higher productivity. You're going to have higher proficiency. You're going to have higher retention, which means you're not spending all this time training new people every 6 months. Right? All of those things matter at dollars and cents. And if you've got happier employees, they're also going to be more productive and more profitable for you. So building employee trust around culture, while it feels squishy, really does translate to dollars and cents.
And when things like this happen, it can be really easy to just laser focus on the specific issue and how to fix it and what to do. And I think some of it, and sure, there's a lot of things that may need to happen right there in the moment, but there's also sort of this like kind of idea of like fix the problem and move on. And I think when you look at situations like the BYU thing, or even this, like, why did someone feel comfortable coming to a game there and shouting that out in the first place? That ought to prompt some maybe some deeper actions and reflection. Same with the whole food situation. So I think that that's kind of like one of the common threads of, hey, what's the immediate actions that need to happen, but sort of also what's the reflection and kind of asking ourselves, what is it that led to this and how do we get here? Because sometimes that can really inform as well.
I think that's particularly important in a Whole Foods situation because Whole Foods was its own separate entity that then got brought into a bigger entity. Who are we? What is the culture? Because that, I think, may be another issue that they're running into, whereas that may have previously been the Whole Foods culture. Is it currently? Well, we want to keep what Whole Foods had. Can you do that if Amazon is running the show? So some of that, again, I think in those reflections, there has to be some intentionality. And lots of times people just let those things happen and they don't just happen. You have to really think about it, be reflective, and actively address it.
And I'll just say, you know, in particular, when there are pieces of, you know, dress code or policies around what you can wear versus what you cannot wear, or, you know, there is a uniform in place. If the goal is to be in uniform, perhaps Whole Foods should have provided standard whole food masks for everyone to wear, because the economic situations of everyone, we don't know how people came into the masks that they received throughout the pandemic. Some of them went to, you know, marches where Black Lives Matter masks were being handed out, and some may not have been able to, you know, obtain free masks from other places or be able to purchase masks from the store. And so if uniformity is what you're after, and there is a standard, you know, Whole Foods green, right? You see the folks walking around with the apron, perhaps as part of the uniform needs to be a Whole Foods mask, because we are now requiring as part of your job that you be in uniform and be in unison and you wear this mask. So we're going to provide that because the mask can make all kinds of statements, not even, you know, Black Lives Matter statements, but, you know, any statement, right? Like, I am an avid cat supporter, whatever the thing is, right? And if that's not Whole Foods brand, then, you know, we should look at ways of how we make sure that all of the employees are representing the brand well when they are here and they are on the clock for us.
If you want to be consistent, do the things to provide the consistency. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, ladies, I cannot tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation, this time. I think it is really important for us as these types of issues arise to really be looking at what the business response should be. I think lots of times we want to be emotional and take our own personal viewpoints, but I think when we're talking about professional issues, there are lots of things that have to be considered, and we want to take this time to really look at what businesses should be doing as they move forward to create a better, diverse, equitable, inclusive environment where all of their employees can belong. So again, I thank you. This has been wonderful, and I look forward to our next conversation. All right. Have a great one.
Thank you, ReGina.
Thank you.